In the spring of 1946, something emerged from the darkness in Texarkana that would make lovers fear the moonlight. Parents locked their doors at 10 weeks of terror that proved sometimes the monster under your bed is real, and sometimes he's never caught. February 14th, 1946, Valentine's Day. While most of America was celebrating love and new beginnings after the war, two young people in Texarkana were about to experience a nightmare that would shatter the peace of an entire region. Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jan Larry were parked on a secluded lover's lane, a dirt road just off Highway 67, about 3 miles from town. It was around midnight. The war was over. Young couples finally had a future to dream about again. But at 11:45 p.m., those dreams turned to screams. A figure appeared at the driver's side window, wearing a white cloth mask over his face with crude holes cut out for eyes. He was holding a pistol, not saying a word, just pointing. Jimmy tried to reason with him, thinking maybe it was a robbery. He reached for his wallet, but the masked man didn't want money. He ordered them out of the car. What happened next was brutal and senseless. The attacker beat Jimmy with the pistol, fracturing his skull. Then he turned his attention to Mary Jean. He assaulted her with the gun, beat her savagely, and when she thought it couldn't get worse, he told her to run. She ran barefoot down that dark road, bleeding, terrified, certain he was following her, certain she was about to die. But she didn't die. Neither did Jimmy. They survived. They reported what happened. And the police in Texarkana thought, hoped, prayed this was an isolated incident, a random act of violence by someone passing through. But 3 weeks later, they realized they were dealing with something far worse. They were dealing with a predator, a phantom who struck only at night, only on deserted roads, and who was just getting started. March 24th. Richard Griffin, age 29, and Polly Ann Moore, 17, went to the movies. They saw a show. They wanted a little privacy afterward, like countless young couples did. They drove to a secluded spot on Old Spring Lake Park Road, another lover's lane on the Texas side of Texarkana. They never came home. The next morning, a passerby noticed Richard's Oldsmobile parked in an unusual position. He stopped to check. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Richard Griffin was slumped in the back seat, shot twice in the back of the head. Polly Ann Moore was on the ground nearby, also shot in the back of the head. Both were positioned in ways that suggested the killer had moved them after death. This wasn't robbery. Their belongings were untouched. This wasn't a crime of passion. Neither victim knew their attacker. This was execution. Cold, methodical, purposeful, and the entire town of Texarkana, population 30,000 split between two states, Texas and Arkansas, suddenly realized that Jimmy and Mary Jean's attacker had returned, and this time he'd come to kill. Before we go any further into this nightmare, if you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and true crime cases that still haunt us decades later, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And tell me in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? I love seeing our community grow worldwide. Now let's talk about why this phantom was so terrifying and why, almost 80 years later, we still don't know who he was. So what made the Phantom Killer different from other criminals? Why did he become one of America's first widely publicized serial killers? The answer lies in his pattern, his methodology, and the sheer terror he inflicted not just on his victims but on an entire community. After the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, Texarkana was on edge. The police worked around the clock. They investigated hundreds of leads. They questioned suspects. They set up roadblocks. They increased patrols on every lover's lane in the area. But they had almost nothing to go on. No fingerprints. No witnesses except Jimmy and Mary Jane from the first attack, and their descriptions were limited. A man, average height, wearing a white mask. That could be anyone. The press started calling him the Phantom. The name stuck because he seemed to appear and disappear like a ghost. No one saw him arrive. No one saw him leave. He struck in darkness and vanished into darkness. And just when people started to think, to hope, that maybe he'd moved on, maybe he'd stopped, he attacked again. April 14th. Almost exactly 3 weeks after the Griffin Moore murders. Paul Martin, 16, and Betty Jo Booker, 15. Betty Jo was a star student, a talented saxophone player in the high school band. Well loved by everyone who knew her. Paul was a good kid, quiet, respectful. They went to a party together that Saturday night. They were supposed to be home by midnight. They never arrived. Their families reported them missing immediately. The next morning, a man driving to work spotted Paul's body on a rural road near Spring Lake Park. He'd been shot 4 times, killed while still sitting in his car, then dumped on the side of the road like trash. Betty Jo's body wasn't found with Paul's. The search intensified. Volunteers combed the woods. Police dogs tracked scents through the brush. Hours passed with no sign of her. Then, around noon, a farmer checking his property found her. She was lying in a ditch about 2 miles from where Paul was discovered. She'd been shot twice in the face at close range. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. Betty Jo had run. Her shoes were found near Paul's car, but she'd run barefoot through the woods trying to escape. The killer had hunted her down, chased her through the darkness, and when he caught her, he executed her. The community exploded in panic. This wasn't just fear anymore. This was hysteria. Hardware stores sold out of locks, chains, guns, ammunition. People stopped going out after dark. Teenagers were forbidden from dating. Lovers' lanes that had been popular for decades became ghost roads, empty and avoided. The Phantom had achieved what terrorists aim for. He'd changed the way an entire population lived their lives. Parents sat up all night with shotguns across their laps. Women refused to stay home alone. Men formed vigilante patrols. And through it all, the police had nothing. No solid leads. No breaks in the case. Just 3 more weeks until the Phantom struck again, May 3rd. Virgil and Katie Starks had been married for years. They lived in a farmhouse about 10 miles northeast of Texarkana on the Arkansas side. They were in their late 30s, hardworking, well-respected in the community. They weren't teenagers parking on lovers' lanes. They were at home, in their own house, behind locked doors. And that's what made this attack so different, so much more terrifying than the others. The Phantom had changed his pattern. If he could strike at a couple in their own home, then no one was safe. Nowhere was safe. It was a Saturday night. Virgil was sitting in his living room, reading the newspaper in his favorite chair by the window. Katie was in the bedroom. Around 10:30 p.m., a shot rang out, then another. The Phantom had crept up to the house, looked through the window, and shot Virgil twice in the back of the head through the glass. Katie heard the shots. She ran into the living room and saw her husband slumped in his chair, blood everywhere. Before she could process what was happening, the Phantom entered the house. He shot her twice, once in the face, once in the chest. Then he fled. But Katie Starks didn't die. Despite 2 gunshot wounds, despite watching her husband murdered in front of her, she survived. She crawled across the floor to a neighbor's house, over half a mile away, bleeding in shock, but determined to get help. She made it. She got help. Virgil was dead, but Katie lived. And for the first time, the Phantom had left a survivor who'd seen him inside a lit house, not just on a dark road. Police thought maybe, finally, they'd have a breakthrough. But Katie's description was vague, inconsistent, confused by trauma and blood loss. A tall man, she said. Or maybe average height, she wasn't sure. Dark clothes. But it was nighttime. Everything was dark. The FBI joined the investigation. Texas Rangers were brought in. The case became national news. Newspapers across America ran headlines about the Phantom Killer of Texarkana. The small town was overrun with reporters, investigators, curiosity seekers. Roadblocks went up on every highway. Every suspicious person was questioned. Every drifter, every stranger, every man who couldn't account for his whereabouts on those specific nights became a suspect. The pressure was enormous. The terror was suffocating. And then, something strange happened. The attacks stopped. May passed. June, July, August. No more attacks. No more murders. The Phantom had vanished as mysteriously as he'd appeared. Had he been scared off by the massive police presence? Had he moved to another city? Had he been arrested for something else? Was he dead? Or was he still out there, watching, waiting, satisfied with the fear he'd created? Nobody knew. And that uncertainty, that not knowing, was almost worse than the attacks themselves. Because when you don't know where the monster went, you can never be sure he's really gone. So who was the Phantom Killer? In the 79 years since these attacks, countless theories have emerged. Hundreds of suspects have been investigated. Some seem promising. Others were clearly innocent. But none have ever been definitively proven guilty. Let's talk about the main suspects and why this case remains one of America's most baffling unsolved mysteries. The primary suspect, the man police focused on more than anyone else, was UL Swinney. He was a petty criminal, a car thief, known to police in the Texarkana area. In the summer of 1946, just months after the last attack, Swinney's wife went to police with a shocking story. She claimed her husband was the Phantom Killer. She said he'd come home on the nights of the attacks with blood on his clothes. She said he'd confessed to her. She said she'd been terrified to speak up earlier because he'd threatened to kill her if she told anyone. Police were ecstatic. Finally, a break in the case. They arrested Swinney immediately. They interrogated him for hours, days, weeks. But Swinney never confessed. He denied everything, said his wife was lying, trying to get revenge because he'd been unfaithful. And here's the problem. Under Texas law at the time, a wife couldn't testify against her husband in court. Her testimony was inadmissible. Without her testimony, police had no case. No physical evidence linked Swinney to any of the crime scenes. No witnesses could identify him. They had nothing but the word of a woman they couldn't put on the stand. So they did something desperate. They charged Swinney with car theft, a crime they could prove, and sent him to prison. The hope was that while he was locked up, they'd find more evidence. They never did. Swinney served his time for car theft and was released. He lived until 1994, dying in Dallas at age 70. He never confessed, never showed remorse, never gave any indication whether he was the Phantom or just an unlucky criminal whose wife tried to frame him. Some investigators remained convinced until their dying day that Swinney was the killer. Others had doubts. The case file listed him as the prime suspect, but prime suspect isn't the same as guilty beyond reasonable doubt. But there were other suspects, other theories. Some investigators believe the Phantom might have been a soldier recently returned from World War II, suffering from what we now call PTSD. The war had just ended. Millions of young men came home traumatized, damaged, struggling to readjust to civilian life. Could one of them have snapped? Could the violence they'd experienced overseas have turned them into a killer? It would explain the military-style precision of the attacks. the execution-style shots to the back of the head, the methodical nature of the crimes, and it would explain why the attacks stopped. Maybe the killer sought help. Maybe he moved away. Maybe he killed himself. We'll never know. Another theory suggests the Phantom might have been a transient worker. Texarkana was a railroad town, a crossroads. People passed through constantly. Day laborers, drifters, men looking for work. Someone could have committed these crimes and simply moved on to the next town, the next job, the next state. In 1946, before computers, before databases, before modern forensics, it was easy to disappear. You could commit a crime in Texas and be in California a week later with a new name, and no one would ever connect you to anything. Several suspects fitting this profile were investigated over the years, but none panned out. Then there's the copycat theory. Some criminologists have suggested that maybe, just maybe, the Phantom wasn't one person. Maybe the first attack by Jimmy and Mary Jean's assailant was unrelated to the murders. Maybe someone else read about that attack in the newspaper and decided to use it as cover for their own crimes. It would explain some of the inconsistencies in the cases. The first attack was brutal, but the victims survived. The next attacks were executions. The Griffin Moore murders and the Martin Booker murders followed a pattern. Couples on lovers' lanes, shot execution style. But the Starks attack was completely different. A married couple at home. Why the change? Was it the same killer evolving, or different killers entirely? Most investigators dismiss this theory. The timeline is too tight, the location too specific. The odds of multiple killers operating in the same small area over the same 3-month period are astronomical, but in the absence of answers, every theory has to be considered. And here's what makes this case so frustrating. The technology to solve it probably exists now. DNA analysis, digital databases, forensic techniques that didn't exist in 1946. But the evidence is gone. The crime scenes were contaminated decades ago. Physical evidence was lost, mishandled, or destroyed. The main witnesses are all dead. The original investigators are all dead. Most of the suspects are dead. In 2003, a cold case unit reopened the investigation. They looked at everything with fresh eyes and modern technology. They tracked down surviving family members. They reviewed old evidence logs. They even exhumed a body to test for DNA. Nothing. No breakthrough. No closure. The case went cold again, and as each year passes, the chances of solving it diminish. By now, if the Phantom was 20 years old in 1946, he'd be 99 today. Most likely he's dead. Most likely he took his secrets to the grave. Most likely we'll never know his name. But let's talk about the impact this case had beyond Texarkana, because the Phantom Killer changed American culture in ways most people don't realize. Before Texarkana, serial killers weren't part of the national conversation. The term didn't even exist yet. There had been serial murderers throughout history, but they weren't understood as a phenomenon. They weren't studied. They weren't profiled. The Phantom changed that. The nationwide coverage of these murders introduced America to the idea that seemingly random killings could be connected, that a single predator could terrorize an entire region, that the person sitting next to you at church or the grocery store could be harboring unimaginable darkness. The case also changed how police departments handled investigations. The cooperation between Texas and Arkansas authorities, between local police and the FBI, between multiple jurisdictions, became a model for future cases. Before Texarkana, departments often refused to share information. Territorial disputes hampered investigations, but the Phantom forced cooperation. The creation of task forces, the sharing of evidence across state lines, the involvement of federal agents in local crimes, all of these became standard practice partly because of lessons learned in Texarkana. And then there's the cultural impact. In 1976, exactly 30 years after the murders, a movie was released called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. It was a dramatization of the Phantom case, blending fact with fiction, horror with history. The film became a cult classic and introduced a new generation to the story. It spawned a remake in 2014. Books have been written, documentaries produced, podcasts recorded. The Phantom Killer has become part of American folklore, a cautionary tale told to teenagers who want to park on dark roads. But behind the legend are real people, real victims, real families who never got justice. Let's talk about those victims, because sometimes in true crime, we focus so much on the killer that we forget the people whose lives were stolen. Betty Jo Booker was 15 years old. 15. She played saxophone in her school band. She had dreams of going to college, of becoming a music teacher. Her parents kept her saxophone for the rest of their lives, unable to part with it, unable to hear music the same way ever again. Betty Jo's little sister was only 7 when it happened. She grew up in a house filled with grief, with unanswered questions, with the ghost of a sister she barely got to know. Paul Martin was 16. He worked part-time to help his family. He was planning to join the military, to serve his country like so many young men did. His mother lived to be 93 years old. That's 77 years of wondering. 77 years of birthdays Paul never celebrated. 77 years of going to bed every night knowing her son's killer was never caught. Can you imagine that? Living almost 8 decades without closure, without justice, without even the small comfort of knowing why. Richard Griffin was 29, a veteran who'd survived World War II. He'd faced enemy fire, bombs, chaos, and death overseas and came home alive, only to be murdered in his hometown by a coward with a gun hiding behind a mask. Polly Ann Moore was 17. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was kind, well-liked, excited about the future. Her family described her as someone who always saw the good in people, and someone took that light and extinguished it on a dark road for no reason anyone could understand. Virgil Starks was 37. He and Katie had built a life together. They had a home, a farm, dreams of growing old together. He was sitting in his own living room, reading the newspaper, probably thinking about what needed to be done on the farm the next day, when a bullet came through the window and ended everything. Katie survived, but she was never the same. How could she be? She lived until 2003, 57 years after that night. 57 years of trauma, of nightmares, of wondering if the man who killed her husband was someone she'd passed on the street. And Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jan Larry, the survivors of the first attack. They lived, yes, but they carried scars for the rest of their lives. Physical scars from the beating, psychological scars that never healed. Mary Jan struggled with the trauma for decades. She had to relive that night every time police questioned her, every time a reporter asked for an interview, every time someone mentioned Texarkana. Jimmy suffered brain damage from the skull fracture. Both of them were robbed of their sense of safety, their innocence, their ability to feel secure in the world. These weren't statistics. They weren't plot points in a horror movie. They were real people with families who loved them, with futures that were stolen, with potential that was never realized. And whoever the Phantom was, he didn't just kill 5 people. He traumatized 2 survivors. He devastated multiple families. He terrified an entire community. And he got away with it. Now here's something that keeps investigators up at night. What if he didn't stop? What if the Phantom left Texarkana and killed somewhere else? In the 1940s and 50s, before computers connected police departments, it was possible to commit crimes in one state and never be connected to crimes in another. There were unsolved murders in Louisiana in 1947. Different MO, different circumstances, but some similarities that made people wonder. There were attacks in California in the early 50s that had echoes of Texarkana. Couples on secluded roads. Execution-style shootings. Were they related or just coincidence? The truth is, we'll probably never know. If the Phantom did kill elsewhere, those cases are just as cold as the Texarkana murders. But it's chilling to think about. How many victims might there have been? How many families in other cities are still waiting for answers about murders that happened in the 40s and 50s? The Phantom could have left a trail of bodies across America, and we'd never know, because the cases were never connected. But let's return to Texarkana, because something fascinating happened in the years after the murders. The town tried to forget. People didn't talk about it. Parents didn't tell their children the stories. It became almost taboo, like mentioning it would summon the Phantom back. For decades, Texarkana tried to bury its dark history, but you can't bury truth. It always resurfaces. When the town, the dreaded Sundown, came out in '76, it forced the conversation back into the open. Suddenly, people were talking again, sharing memories, comparing notes, and some new information emerged. Elderly residents came forward with stories they'd never told police. A man who'd seen someone suspicious near one of the crime scenes but had been too scared to report it. A woman who'd received threatening phone calls in the weeks after the murders. A shopkeeper who remembered selling a white cloth hood to a customer who paid cash and left quickly. None of it was enough to solve the case, but it painted a picture of a community that had been more terrified than anyone realized. People had been too scared to come forward in 1946. Too worried the Phantom might come after them if they said anything. Think about that level of fear. A fear so powerful that people kept silent even when it might have helped catch a killer. That's the legacy of the Phantom. Not just the murders themselves, but the lasting trauma, the generational fear, the way an entire community was changed forever by 3 months of terror. Texarkana today is a different place. It's grown. It's modernized. But there are still old-timers who remember those nights when nobody went out after dark, when Lover's Lane became a death sentence, when moonlight meant danger. And here's something most people don't know. The Texarkana Phantom case directly influenced how America thinks about and investigates serial crimes. After the attacks stopped and the case went cold, the FBI studied what happened. They analyzed the pattern, the victimology, the escalation, the sudden stop. This case became one of the foundational studies for what would eventually become the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The profiles they created, the theories they developed, the understanding of how serial offenders operate, all of it was informed in part by the Phantom. So in a twisted way, the 5 people who died and the survivors who were traumatized contributed to a system that has helped catch countless killers since then. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It taught law enforcement valuable lessons about criminal behavior, about the importance of preserving evidence, about the need for interagency cooperation. It's cold comfort for the families, but it's something. Their loved ones' deaths helped prevent other deaths, helped catch other killers, helped spare other families the same grief. But back to the central question, who was the Phantom? Let's examine what we actually know, not theories or speculation, but facts. The Phantom was comfortable in rural areas. He knew the lovers' lanes around Texarkana. He knew the back roads, the secluded spots, the areas where he wouldn't be seen. That suggests someone local or someone who'd spent significant time in the area. The Phantom was calculated. These weren't crimes of passion or opportunity. He planned them. He brought weapons. He chose locations carefully. He struck when couples were most vulnerable and least likely to resist effectively. The Phantom was physically capable. He overpowered multiple victims. He moved bodies. He chased Betty Jo Booker through woods in the dark. He approached the Starks' house without being detected. This wasn't an old man or someone physically limited. The Phantom had access to firearms and knew how to use them. The shots were precise. Execution style. That level of accuracy suggests either military training, hunting experience, or extensive practice. In 1946 Texarkana, that could describe half the male population. World War II had just ended. Every young man had either served in the military or grown up hunting for food during the Depression. The Phantom wore a mask in the first attack, but didn't seem to worry about being identified in subsequent attacks. Why? Either he was killing witnesses so they couldn't identify him, or he was confident enough in his anonymity that he didn't think it mattered. That's a chilling level of confidence. It suggests someone who felt secure in his position, someone who thought he was smarter than the police, someone who may have been watching the investigation unfold, reading the newspaper coverage, maybe even talking to investigators as a concerned citizen while secretly reveling in the chaos he'd created. The Phantom stopped after the Starks' attack. Why? Did Katie's survival scare him? Was he worried she'd seen enough to identify him? Did the massive police response make it too risky to continue? Or did he get what he wanted? Some killers have a specific goal, a specific number, a specific type of victim. Once they achieve it, they stop. It's rare, but it happens. Could the Phantom have had some twisted mission that was completed after 5 murders? Or, and this is the theory that keeps coming back, was UL Swinney arrested for car theft right around the time the murders stopped? Is that why they stopped? Not because the Phantom chose to stop, but because he was locked up for an unrelated crime? Swinney maintained his innocence his entire life, but guilty people often do, and the timing is suspicious. The murders stop. Swinney gets arrested. The murders never resume. Even after Swinney is released from prison years later, no similar attacks occur in Texarkana. That's either an incredible coincidence, or it's the answer everyone's been looking for. But without proof, without evidence, without a confession, UL Swinney is just a suspect. A likely suspect, maybe even the most likely suspect, but still just a suspect. And in America, we're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. Swinney was never proven guilty of the Phantom murders. So officially, legally, the case remains unsolved. The Phantom killer remains unidentified, and justice remains unserved. There's another angle to this case that's often overlooked: the role of the media. In 1946, this was one of the first cases to receive sustained national media attention. Radio broadcasts, newspaper headlines coast to coast, magazine articles. The public was fascinated and horrified, and that media attention did 2 things. First, it put enormous pressure on law enforcement. Police weren't just answering to their local community anymore. They were answering to the entire country. Every decision was scrutinized. Every lead that didn't pan out was criticized. That pressure led to mistakes. Evidence was rushed. Suspects were arrested prematurely. The investigation became as much about managing public perception as it was about catching the killer. Second, the media attention may have fed the Phantom's ego. Many criminal psychologists believe he was following the coverage, reading about himself, enjoying the fear he'd created. The nickname, Phantom Killer, made him seem almost supernatural, larger than life. Some profilers think that perception of power, that media-created mystique, may have been part of his motivation. He wasn't just killing people. He was becoming infamous. He was achieving a dark form of immortality, and 79 years later, we're still talking about him. In a sick way, he won. But here's what the Phantom didn't win. He didn't destroy Texarkana. The town survived. The people survived. They came together. They supported each other. They rebuilt their sense of community and safety. It took years, maybe decades, but they did it. The Phantom wanted to create lasting fear. He wanted to be remembered as the boogeyman who owned the night. Instead, he's remembered as a coward who murdered innocent people and ran away. The real legacy of Texarkana isn't the Phantom. It's the resilience of the people who refuse to let fear define them. Today, if you visit Texarkana, you won't find monuments to the Phantom. You won't find plaques marking the crime scenes. The lovers' lanes are still there, reclaimed by nature and time, but they're not tourist attractions. They're quiet places where tragedy happened, places that families prefer to leave in peace. The old Spring Lake Park, where some of the attacks occurred, is now just another park. People picnic there, children play there, life goes on, because that's what life does. It finds a way to continue even after horror. The families of the victims have mostly passed away now. Betty Jo Booker's little sister, the one who was 7 years old when her sister was murdered, lived into her 80s. She spent her entire life carrying that loss, that unanswered question. Katie Starks, who survived being shot twice and crawled half a mile for help, lived to be 91 years old. She gave occasional interviews over the years, always hoping someone would come forward with information, always hoping for closure. She died in 2003 without ever getting it. And that's perhaps the cruelest part of unsolved cases. The victims die twice. Once when they're killed, and again when the last person who remembers them personally passes away. When there's no one left to share stories about their laugh, their dreams, their quirks that made them unique, they become names in a case file, photographs in an archive, details in a true crime documentary. And while we honor their memory by keeping their stories alive, it's not the same as justice. It's not the same as answers. So what do we take from the story of the Texarkana Phantom Killer? What lesson exists in this darkness? Maybe it's this: evil exists. It's real. It's not always caught. It's not always punished. Sometimes the bad guy gets away. Sometimes there's no neat resolution, no satisfying ending where the detective gathers everyone in the library and reveals the killer. Sometimes there's just pain and loss and questions that echo through generations. But here's the other side of that truth. Good also exists. Community exists. Resilience exists. The people of Texarkana didn't let the Phantom win. They didn't abandon their town. They didn't let fear consume them forever. They mourned. They grieved. They remembered. And then they chose to keep living. The families of the victims showed incredible strength. They could have been destroyed by their loss. Some struggled, certainly. How could they not? But they continued. They raised children. They built lives. They found moments of joy even while carrying unbearable sorrow. That's not weakness. That's not forgetting. That's survival. That's choosing hope over despair. And maybe that's the real story of Texarkana. Not the darkness of 10 weeks in 1946, but the light of 79 years of refusing to let that darkness be the final word. The Phantom Killer took 5 lives. He traumatized countless others. He created fear that lasted for generations. But he didn't take Texarkana's humanity. He didn't take their compassion. He didn't take their ability to love and trust and hope. And in the end, maybe that matters more than whether we ever learn his name. Because the name doesn't change what happened. The name doesn't bring anyone back. The name is just a detail. What matters is how we respond to evil when we encounter it. Do we become bitter? Do we become cynical? Do we let it poison everything we touch? Or do we acknowledge the pain, honor the victims, and choose to be better than the darkness that touched us? I don't have the answer to who the Phantom Killer was. Nobody does. Maybe it was UL Swinney. Maybe it was someone else entirely. Maybe it was someone whose name never even came up in the investigation. Maybe we'll never know. But I do know this. The people of Texarkana deserve better. The victims deserve better. Their families deserve better. And while we can't give them justice, we can give them remembrance. We can make sure their stories aren't forgotten. We can make sure that Betty Jo Booker isn't just victim number 4, but a 15-year-old girl who loved music. We can make sure Paul Martin is remembered as a 16-year-old boy with dreams, not just a name on a memorial. If you've made it this far, thank you for bearing witness to this story. Thank you for caring about people you never met, about events that happened before most of us were born. That empathy, that willingness to remember and honor the past, that's what separates us from people like the Phantom. He saw victims. We see human beings. He created fear. We create understanding. And that difference, that fundamental difference in how we see the world, that's everything. Before you go, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell. Because next week, we're covering another case that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and the nature of evil. You won't want to miss it. And here's my question for you, the one I want you to answer in the comments. If you could ask the Phantom Killer one question, knowing he'd have to answer truthfully, what would you ask him?